Hello, American history. Hope you're doing well. We are getting closer to the end of the school year. We are almost there. This last 9 weeks has been very different, but we have continued to been able to learn about American history and do assignments online and through computers and through technology. And so we are almost there, though. We are just a couple weeks away. And so thank you for your cooperation and your hard work. And just we're almost there. We just got a little bit more to go. So you can do it. Well, this week, what we are talking about is a couple things. We are talking about the 20s in America, and then what follows after that, the Great Depression. We will going to talk about a few about these things, just a little bit about them. We don't get to go in complete detail just because we don't have necessarily as much time as we would if we were in the classroom. But we are going to continue to learn about these about American history and these two things. They are both big things in American history. And so I'm going to share with you this week a little bit about both of these events. After World War I, the President of the United States, he won the election of 1920, about 100 years ago, was Warren G. Harding. But he would not be president very long. He would be president for 3 years, and then after he would pass away, and then Calvin Coolidge, his vice president, would become the next president of the United States. America wished to stay out of foreign affairs. They did not want to be involved internationally after World War I. They wanted a break. They did not want to, be fighting and thinking about things, that were not involved in the country right then. And so they preferred to be isolated, and they chose that. And they did that. They wanted things to be back to normal, kind of like we want things to be back to normal in the state that we're in. We are facing COVID-19, the coronavirus, and so things have been very different. Well, things were different in World War I for the American people. And so they wanted to get back to normal before World War I, just like we are starting to go through the process of getting back to normal before COVID-19. And so that's what the American people wanted. But at first, America was struggling to get back to the normal they wanted once the war was over. People were not working as much as they wanted to, and the economy was not doing well. But that would soon change. The 1920s would have several changes in America. Some significant inventions and improvements for technology in the 1920s where automobiles were mass produced and more affordable, so most families could have one and be able to travel to the city and really wherever they wanted to in the country. In the early 1900s, the Model T by Henry Ford was made, but it was not as accessible and affordable for people. Where during this time, people could afford it. A lot more people had automobiles and they could travel to wherever they needed to go. Airplanes became more popular as they were used in World War I and helped America win the war. They became used for other purposes other than for military. In 1927, Charles A. Lindbergh, he was 25 years old, and he flew an airplane on his own from New York to Paris. That is just crazy. He flew across the Atlantic from New York to Paris. And this was a huge deal. For one, he did it by himself. And another, it never been done before. When they would take the planes for the war, they would ship them off in a boat. They would go across the water on a ship, on a boat. Well, Charles A. Lindbergh would fly his airplane across the Atlantic to Paris. That was a huge deal and a huge development in the 1920s. And he was only 25 years old. Look at how young he was. And he was very celebrated and congratulated for his achievement. After this, flying became a regular form of transportation in America. And people were flying from different cities across the U.S. and it would expand to internationally. So flying, this is when we see that flying starts to become big in the United States. After a brief slump in the economy, America started to do well. Business began to be booming. It was doing really well. People started new businesses. Industry grew to the needs of people. You think about it. People, started to need cars. They started to, need, food, more, food. They needed clothes. They needed a number of different things. And so, as a result, the economy and business was booming. Assembly lines became a normal practice for businesses. Assembly lines were not a new thing, but more people were using them, and it was became a common practice for factories and businesses. Well, the 1920s in America became known as the Roaring Twenties, roaring because of all the changes that were happening in America. Young people began to hold parties and do wild and crazy things. They would just, rebel, and if they were told not to do something, they would just do it. Have you ever done something like that? Have you ever done something you're not supposed to do? But they would just act crazy and do just things that they weren't supposed to do. Movies became very popular. People would go to movie theaters, and they were widely used, and it was a way of entertainment for people. That's where it started to grow as far as, hey, you want to go to the movies? You want to go really to the picture show? It's called a motion picture show. Young women became known as flappers, which means they dressed differently than they did before. They wore heavy makeup. They participated in new dances. And really, it was just different than it was before the 1920s. Instead of life just kind of being more quiet, it started to be wild and crazy and loud. And so that's what was going on with that. Dancing and jazz music grew in the 1920s. Think about it. They had just won the war, and so they had reason to celebrate. And so sports became popular and grew in the 1920s. College football, boxing, baseball, golf, horse racing, and auto racing became very popular in America. And so we see the rise of sports, another venue of entertainment. Seeing athletes play and do amazing things. Babe Ruth was popular during this time. The great Bambino, he was named. He was the reigning home run leader for a number of years before his record would be broken by Hank Aaron later on. But people would participate in these forms of entertainment to enjoy life in America. Prohibition abstaining from alcohol was during this time. It was an amendment of the United States, the 18th Amendment, and there were several people that were not fond of this law, and they did not like it. The goal was really just to, allow people to just be more pure, and really just alcohol can cause negative effects, and so it was really to limit those and dissolve those negative effects. But there were several people that did not like that this law, this amendment was passed, and so they would sneak alcohol. A thing called bootlegging occurred. This was the making and selling of liquor and doing it illegally. It was prohibited. Could not do this, and so it was called bootlegging. They would make it and sell it. They were known as bootleggers. Places that sold alcohol were called speakeasies. They were more like in basements and places hidden or underground on like a where people couldn't really see them. And so they were called speakeasies, places that sold alcohol. Prohibition was not working like the lawmakers and supporters of it had intended. And Prohibition would later end in 1933. People were just sneaking around with it and really not following it. And so it did not go as lawmakers and supporters had intended. Well, it was a great time for people in the 1920s. But it would not end that way. In 1928, Herbert Hoover became President of the United States of America. So things are going really well. People are having a good time. Business is booming. But the 20s, excitement and change went in on a depressing note. In October 1929, the stock market crashed, resulting in people losing most of the money, if not all the money that they had. There were different reasons to the depression and the crash. People were not in need as much. They still had needs, food and clothes, but they didn't need as much because they already had it. They were, just not buy as much. People would use credit to buy different things, saying like, like credit cards or, make payments along the way, and people were not making their payments. Or when it was time to pay for what they had bought or used credit on, they did not have the money still. And so they were losing out on that. And a number of other different factors resulted in the Great Depression. Another thing was, including in that, was the government was trying to help not cause the depression, but they did more damage leading to it as well. And so there were a lot of different factors in the Depression. As a result, the Great Depression happened in 1929. As a result, millions of Americans were out of work because of the Depression. They could not be paid at their jobs, and so they lost their job. Banks were starting to close, so they couldn't get their money out of the bank, or they would get all their money out of the bank, and so the bank would close. And so it was just a dark time in our country, in the United States of America. Several Americans, like I said, millions of Americans lost their jobs, and as a result, several Americans lost their homes. They would live in abandoned old boxcars. The boxcars that you see like on a train, they would live in that. Or they would build shacks on the street for like boxes or old sheet metal, old scraps. They would do whatever they could to have shelter for their family. Imagine living in a boxcar or living in a cardboard box or something, or a tent, out in the street. It was a very dark time for these people. They had just celebrated, winning a war. They had celebrated, time in the 20s, and now that was coming to an end at the end of the decade. The shacks built on the street became known as Hoovervilles. They blamed Herbert Hoover for the Great Depression and the stock market crash. And so they would use his name for different things. So like I said, the groups of shacks that people would live in were known as Hoovervilles. There was a term they would use call for, like, if you had empty pockets, like you didn't have money, and a pocket turned inside out where you could see it was called a Hoover flag. A newspaper used as a cover was called a Hoover blanket. And so people blamed Herbert Hoover and thought, he's not helping us. He's the reason we're in this mess in the first place. And so they would coin his name for different things. Well, Herbert Hoover tried to solve problems, but he was not popular with Americans. They did not like him. They thought the Depression was his fault. And they did not think he was doing enough to fix the problem. And so in the election of 1932, Hoover would not be reelected. Instead, Franklin D. Roosevelt would become president of the United States of America. Franklin Roosevelt was Teddy Roosevelt's distant cousin. And so they're related by cousins. And Franklin D. Roosevelt was what the nation needed. He would bring hope and a new slate to the people. He is the only president to serve more than 2 terms. So 2 terms means like 8 years. So a term would be 4 years. So 2 terms would be 8 years. In fact, he served 4 terms. He served 16 years. He was president for 16 years. A president these days cannot serve more than 2 terms, so 8 years. But during that time, there was no amendment or law that prevented a president from serving more than 2 terms. And so he was president for 16 years. And so he was able to do a great amount of work for America and its people. He would help America out of the Depression with his New Deal. Your assignments for this week, you have 2 assignments. One assignment is a worksheet on what we have just covered. You can use your notes from this video as you work on the worksheet. It'll be matching the correct term with the correct description or phrase. And then the other assignment is I will have a video of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal about how he helped America get out of the Depression and the programs and the work that he did. That will explain and summarize what he did. And so on that video, I want you to write 5 facts. 5 facts. It's a great video. Like I said, it helps explain and break down what he did, in a short amount of time. And so you can see all that Franklin Roosevelt did to help get America out of the Depression and the good that he did for America. And so those are your 2 assignments, your worksheet on what we have just covered, and then the 5 video facts of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal. I'll have a link for you for that. It's a great video. And remember, these are due on Friday at 5 o'clock. Friday at 5 o'clock. Well, I hope you enjoy learning about the 20s, the roaring 20s in the United States, and about what happened with America in the Great Depression, how Franklin Roosevelt would bring and help America out of the Depression. Hope you enjoy learning about these this week. Thank you.